The impossible morning. Picture this, June 8th, 793 AD. Dawn breaks over a small tidal island off the northeastern coast of Northumbria, England. Holy Island, Lindisfarne, rises from the North Sea like a fortress of faith, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that disappears twice daily beneath the waves. On this island, fewer than 100 monks live in wooden buildings clustered around a stone church. They are unarmed. They are unprepared. And they are about to become the first documented victims of what would become 3 centuries of terror, the Viking Age. The monks of Lindisfarne had no idea that before the sun set, their blood would stain the altar of St. Cuthbert, their treasures would vanish across the North Sea, and the entire Christian world would tremble at news of their destruction. They couldn't have known that the portents witnessed earlier that year, the immense whirlwinds, the fiery dragons flying through the air, the flashes of lightning that tore across the sky were not divine warnings but coincidental preludes to a catastrophe that would reshape European history. Here's what historians don't tell you. Lindisfarne wasn't chosen at random. It was targeted with cold, calculating precision. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. It was the announcement that a new power had arrived in Europe, one that traveled not on roads but on waves, one that worshipped not Christ but Thor and Odin, one that saw Christian sanctuaries not as sacred ground but as warehouses full of unguarded wealth. The mathematics of destruction were brutally simple. Dozens of warriors armed with battle-axes, swords and spears against monks carrying nothing but prayer books and crosses. But numbers alone don't capture what happened that day. What happened at Lindisfarne was more than a raid. It was a psychological earthquake that sent shockwaves from Northumbria to Rome, from Charlemagne's court in Aachen to the monasteries of Ireland. It was the moment when Christian Europe realized that their God might not protect them after all. This is the story of how fewer than 100 Viking warriors destroyed the most sacred Christian site in northern England, killed or enslaved dozens of monks, plundered treasures accumulated over 150 years, and sailed away unpunished, launching an age of terror that would last 300 years. The sacred target. To understand why Lindisfarne's destruction sent such shockwaves through medieval Europe, you need to understand what this place meant. Lindisfarne wasn't just another monastery. It was the spiritual heart of Northumbria, the very place where, as contemporaries described it, the Christian religion began in our nation. In 635 AD, Saint Aidan had arrived from the monastery of Iona to establish Christianity among the pagan Anglo-Saxons of Northumbria. He chose Lindisfarne deliberately, close enough to the royal capital of Bamberg for protection, isolated enough for contemplation, accessible yet defensible, or so they thought. For 158 years, the monastery flourished. It became a center of learning and manuscript production, creating masterpieces like the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the finest illuminated manuscripts ever produced in medieval Europe. But here's what made Lindisfarne such a target: wealth, massive, concentrated, undefended wealth. Think about the economics of 8th century monasteries. Kings and nobles seeking salvation donated land, gold, silver, and precious objects. Pilgrims brought offerings. The church accumulated treasures for 150 years without spending them. No armies to pay, no wars to fight. By 793 AD, Lindisfarne's monastery contained golden chalices, silver candlesticks, jeweled reliquaries, illuminated gospels with covers adorned with gold and precious stones, and perhaps most valuable of all, the shrine of St. Cuthbert himself, decorated with offerings from generations of pilgrims. St. Cuthbert, who had died in 687 AD, was the most venerated saint in northern England. His incorrupt body lay in a magnificent shrine that attracted pilgrims from across Britain and continental Europe. The monastery grew rich from these pilgrims, receiving grants of land from kings and nobles, as well as gifts of money and precious objects. The mathematics were staggering: 106 years of accumulated donations, concentrated in wooden buildings defended by monks who had taken vows of nonviolence. Here's the strategic situation in 793 AD. Northumbria was in chaos. King Aelfald had been murdered by conspirators in 788 AD. His successor Osred II lasted less than a year before being overthrown and killed. The political instability meant no coordinated coastal defenses, no standing army, no system for warning threatened communities of approaching danger. Meanwhile, across the North Sea in Scandinavia, a perfect storm of circumstances was creating the conditions for expansion. Scandinavia in the late 8th century faced a population boom. Improved agricultural techniques meant more people survived, but the amount of farmable land remained fixed. Younger sons with no inheritance looked overseas for opportunity. Simultaneously, Scandinavian shipwrights had perfected the longship, arguably the most revolutionary military technology of the medieval period. The Viking longship was a masterpiece of engineering that gave Norse raiders capabilities no other force in Europe possessed. Built from overlapping planks of oak, these vessels measured 60 to 100 feet in length, drew less than 3 feet of water, and could carry 30 to 60 warriors. Here's what made them so devastating. They could cross open ocean, navigate up shallow rivers, and even be dragged overland between waterways. They were fast, capable of speeds up to 15 knots under oar power. They were maneuverable, able to reverse direction without turning around using reversible oars. And they were shallow drafted, able to beach directly on shore for instant deployment of troops. Think about what this meant tactically. Traditional medieval armies traveled on roads, which meant their movements were predictable and slow. You could see them coming for days. You could prepare defenses or evacuate. Viking raiders appeared without warning from the sea, struck with overwhelming force, and vanished before any defense could be organized. The Vikings had achieved something no European power possessed: strategic mobility combined with tactical surprise. The Norse warriors who would attack Lindisfarne had been honing their skills for decades. Earlier raids in 789 AD had struck the coast of Wessex, killing a royal official who tried to bring the strangers to court. These weren't random pirates. These were professional warriors from a warrior culture where martial skill determined social status, where dying in battle guaranteed paradise in Valhalla, where courage was the highest virtue and cowardice the deepest shame. By June 793 AD, all the pieces were in place: skilled warriors with revolutionary ships, a rich target with no defenses, and political chaos that ensured no organized response. The monks of Lindisfarne prayed every day for God's protection. They were about to discover that God wasn't listening. The gathering storm. Here's what the monks didn't know: their doom was already in motion. Somewhere across the North Sea, probably in Norway or Denmark, Viking chieftains had gathered their warriors. We don't know the leader's name. History didn't preserve it, because to the Vikings, this was just another raid. They couldn't have known they were about to launch an age. The preparations would have been methodical. Longships needed crews of 30 to 60 men, skilled rowers who could maintain their rhythm for hours, warriors who could fight immediately after hours at sea, navigators who could find their way across open ocean using only the sun, stars, and wave patterns. The Vikings had no compasses. Those wouldn't reach Europe for another 300 years. Instead, they used a combination of celestial navigation, knowledge of bird migration patterns, watercolor changes that indicated depth and proximity to land, and possibly the legendary sunstone, a crystal that could detect the sun's position even through cloud cover. Think about the audacity of what they were attempting. They were going to sail across the North Sea, one of the world's most dangerous bodies of water, in open boats, navigate to a specific target on a coastline they'd probably scouted before, execute a lightning raid against a defended position, load their plunder, and sail back before any response could be organized. One miscalculation in navigation, and they'd miss England entirely. One storm, and they'd all drown. One vigorous defense, and they might lose warriors they couldn't replace. But they'd done their intelligence work. Someone had been to Lindisfarne before, possibly as a trader, possibly on an earlier scouting mission. Someone had noted the monastery's wealth, the lack of defenses, the tidal patterns that would strand any pursuing ships. Someone had observed that the monks lived in wooden buildings that would burn, that they had no weapons, that the nearest military garrison was miles away. The raid fleet probably consisted of 3 to 5 longships, enough warriors to overwhelm any resistance, few enough to remain mobile and escape quickly. We are talking about 100 to 250 men total, though the actual raiding party might have been smaller, with some warriors remaining with the ships to ensure a quick getaway. They would have departed from Scandinavia during the brief summer campaign season when the North Sea was least dangerous and the long northern days provided maximum sailing time. The crossing would have taken anywhere from 2 to 5 days depending on weather and winds. During that time, warriors bylaid water constantly, rowed in shifts, and endured the cold spray of the North Sea. There was no shelter, no warmth, no comfort. This was the price of glory. As they approached the Northumbrian coast, the navigators would have looked for landmarks, the distinctive shape of the Farne Islands, the way the land rose and fell, the color of the water. They timed their approach for early morning, when they could use the rising sun at their backs to blind any watchers on shore, when the tide would be right for beaching their ships and later for a quick escape. Picture the scene, June 8, 793 AD, just before dawn. The monks of Lindisfarne are rising for their morning prayers. The first service of the day, Lords, begins at sunrise. The monastery is waking up, monks washing, dressing in their simple robes, gathering in the church for prayer. Some are preparing the morning meal. Others are working in the scriptorium, carefully copying manuscripts. The elderly abbot is perhaps preparing for the day's administrative duties. Young novices are learning their prayers. No one is watching the sea. This is what historians don't emphasize enough: the complete, total, devastating surprise. The monks had no warning system, no scouts, no concept that danger could arrive from the ocean. Their worldview didn't include the possibility of a seaborne assault. Warfare in 8th century England meant armies marching on roads, sieges of fortified towns, battles between organized forces of armed men. It didn't mean dragon-prowed ships appearing out of the dawn mist, carrying warriors who worshipped strange gods and sought nothing but plunder and blood. The Vikings beached their ships on the sandy shore, the sound of wood grinding against sand, the splash of warriors jumping into shallow water, the rattle of weapons being drawn, the guttural shouts in Old Norse, a language none of the monks would have understood. And then they ran. Warriors who had trained for combat since childhood, who had spent days at sea dreaming of this moment, who knew that their success depended on speed and violence, charged up the beach toward the wooden buildings of the monastery. The age of the Vikings had begun. The mathematics of massacre. Here's where the brutal arithmetic takes over. Conservative estimates suggest the monastery housed between 60 and 100 monks, maybe a few more including novices and lay workers. They were men of God, priests, scholars, scribes, farmers. Some were elderly, some were children, none were warriors. They owned no weapons except perhaps tools that could serve as improvised clubs, axes for chopping wood, hammers for construction, knives for preparing food. Against them, possibly 50 to 150 Viking warriors, men who had trained for combat since they could walk. Men armed with specifically designed killing tools, battle-axes with 3-foot-long handles that could cleave through skull and bone with a single blow, swords made from pattern-welded steel, weapons so valuable they were given names and passed down through generations, spears with barbed heads designed to be difficult to remove from wounds, seekses, long knives perfect for close-quarters butchery, round wooden shields bound with iron rims, and possibly chain mail or leather armor for the wealthier warriors. The disparity wasn't just in numbers or weapons, it was in psychology, in training, in cultural values. The Vikings had sailed for days across dangerous seas specifically to kill and plunder. They had suppressed any compassion, any doubt, any mercy. Their culture celebrated warriors who showed no fear, no hesitation. Their religion promised paradise, Valhalla, specifically to those who died in battle. They had been raised hearing stories of successful raids, of warriors who returned home rich with plunder and glory. The monks, by contrast, had taken vows of peace. Their entire worldview was built on the belief that God would protect them, that their sacred status made them inviolate. When armored men with battle-axes burst into their church, it wasn't just a physical attack, it was a theological crisis. Their faith told them this couldn't be happening. Their training told them not to resist. Their instincts screamed at them to run. The attack began at approximately dawn, perhaps 6 in the morning in early June. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that heathen men came and miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. That sentence, written later by traumatized survivors, conceals the horror of what actually happened. Alcuin of York, the Northumbrian scholar serving in Charlemagne's court, received news of the attack and wrote a letter to Higbald, the Bishop of Lindisfarne, that provides the most detailed contemporary account. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its furnishing, exposed to the plundering of pagans. Think about that phrase, spattered with the blood of the priests of God. Alcuin was a scholar, a man of education and restraint. For him to use such visceral language suggests the reality was even worse than his words conveyed. The Vikings burst into the church during morning prayers. The monks were gathered, unarmed, vulnerable. What happened next was systematic slaughter. Battle-axes rose and fell. Blood sprayed across stone walls and wooden floors. Men praying for mercy were cut down where they knelt. The altar, the most sacred object in the church, became a chopping block for human flesh. Contemporary sources tell us the raiders killed some of the monks and stripped others naked. This detail is significant. Stripping victims naked served multiple purposes. It humiliated them, it made them easier to control if they were being taken as slaves, and it allowed the Vikings to search for valuables hidden in clothing. Many were drowned in the sea, probably a combination of monks trying to escape by swimming and Vikings deliberately throwing victims into the water, weighted down with stones, or simply held under until they stopped struggling. Some, including children, they took back to their boats in chains, perhaps to ransom, perhaps to sell into slavery. The Viking slave trade was extensive. Slaves, thralls, were valuable commodities in Scandinavian society. Young, healthy captives could be sold for good prices at markets across the Viking world. Children were particularly valuable because they could be trained and would provide years of labor. The economics of slavery made certain victims more valuable alive than dead. But make no mistake, the primary goal wasn't taking prisoners, it was plunder, and Lindisfarne was rich. The Vikings systematically looted the monastery. They ripped golden covers off gospel books. The books themselves were worthless to them, but the gold and jewels adorning the covers were portable wealth. They stripped silver candlesticks from the altar. They tore down jeweled crosses. They smashed open reliquaries, containers holding the physical remains of saints, dumping out sacred bones to steal the gold and silver caskets. Here's what makes this particularly devastating. The Vikings desecrated the shrine of St. Cuthbert. This wasn't just theft. It was blasphemy so profound that Christians throughout Europe were shocked. St. Cuthbert's shrine was the spiritual center of northern England. Pilgrims had traveled hundreds of miles to pray there. Kings had knelt before it. It represented 106 years of accumulated devotion, gifts, and sacred power. The Vikings didn't care. They saw a box decorated with gold. They took the gold. The raiding party worked with practiced efficiency. Some warriors stood guard, watching for any approaching forces. Others moved through the monastery buildings, searching for hidden valuables. They knew what to look for. Churches always kept their most valuable treasures near the altar, in sacristies, in the abbot's quarters. They ransacked dormitories, storage rooms, the scriptorium where monks copied manuscripts. Anything valuable went into sacks. Anything that couldn't be carried was destroyed. The entire raid probably lasted less than 4 hours. By 10 in the morning, the Vikings were loading their ships. By noon, they were gone, vanished back across the North Sea, leaving behind smoking ruins, corpses, and traumatized survivors. Here's the brutal accounting: dozens of monks killed outright, dozens more drowned or later dying of wounds, perhaps 20 to 30 taken as slaves. The monastery's treasures, accumulated over 158 years, gone in a morning. The church desecrated, the shrine of St. Cuthbert violated. The psychological impact, incalculable. But here's what's crucial: the Vikings suffered 0 casualties. There was no battle, there was no heroic last stand, there was no divine intervention. The raiders came, killed, stole, and left, and no one stopped them. Think about what that meant for medieval Europe. For 800 years since the fall of Rome, Christian monasteries had been safe. Oh, there were wars between Christian kingdoms, battles between armies, but there was an unspoken agreement. Churches were off limits. They were neutral ground, sacred space. Even in the midst of war, armies didn't massacre monks and plunder altars. The Vikings didn't share that agreement. They didn't recognize Christian sanctuaries as sacred. They didn't fear divine retribution. They worshipped gods who valued courage and strength, who despised weakness and cowardice. From their perspective, a monastery full of wealthy, unarmed men was the perfect target, low risk, high reward. The sun set on June 8, 793 AD over a transformed world. Lindisfarne still stood. Stone churches don't burn easily, but it was a corpse of its former self. Blood pooled in the church. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Survivors huddled in shock, unable to process what had happened. The carefully copied manuscripts, the years of scholarship, the treasures of faith, all gone or destroyed. And across the North Sea, Viking warriors celebrated. They had struck the richest target they'd ever seen. They had faced no serious resistance. They had loaded their ships with more silver and gold than most would see in their lives. And most importantly, they had survived. Word would spread. Other Viking chieftains would hear about the undefended wealth of Christian monasteries. They would look at the map of Europe's coastlines and see not churches but opportunities. They would build more ships, recruit more warriors, and plan more raids. Lindisfarne wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. The shockwave. News traveled slowly in 793 AD. No telecommunications, no mass media, no internet. Information moved at the speed of a horse, about 30 miles per day on Roman roads. Slower on medieval tracks, but despite this, news of Lindisfarne's destruction spread across Europe with shocking speed. Why? Because it was unbelievable, because it shattered fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. Alcuin of York heard about it in Aachen, roughly 600 miles away, within weeks. His reaction, preserved in letters, reveals the psychological trauma the raid inflicted. Writing to Bishop Higbald of Lindisfarne, Alcuin struggled to understand. Lo, it is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Think about that, 350 years. That's longer than the United States has existed. Imagine an entire civilization's sense of security obliterated in a single morning. But Alcuin's most revealing comments came in another letter to King Ethelred of Northumbria. Never before has such an atrocity been seen in Britain as that which the pagans have now inflicted upon us. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its furnishings, exposed to the plundering of pagans, the place more sacred than any in Britain. Alcuin, remember, was a scholar, educated, rational, theologically sophisticated, and even he couldn't process what had happened without invoking divine punishment. He wrote, "Consider carefully, brothers, and examine diligently, lest perchance this unaccustomed and unheard-of evil was merited by some unheard-of evil practice." In other words, maybe we deserved this. Maybe God allowed this attack because we sinned. This theological rationalization was psychologically necessary because the alternative was unbearable, that God couldn't or wouldn't protect his most faithful servants. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled later but drawing on contemporary accounts, recorded ominous portents. In this year terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and miserably frightened the inhabitants. These were exceptional flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air, and soon followed a great famine. And after that, in the same year, the harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. Fiery dragons flying in the air. We might explain these as auroras, comets, or meteorological phenomena, but to medieval Christians, they were unmistakable warnings from God. The problem was, warnings about what? The raid had already happened. Either the portents were warnings that had been ignored, or they were divine anger expressed through natural phenomena. Either way, it suggested God's displeasure with his people. This is what historians often miss. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't just a military defeat. It was a theological crisis. It challenged fundamental Christian beliefs about divine protection, about the power of prayer, about the sanctity of holy ground. If God wouldn't protect his most devoted servants in his own house, what protection could ordinary Christians expect? The psychological impact rippled across Europe. Monasteries that had stood unfortified for centuries suddenly looked vulnerable. Abbots who had spent their lives in contemplation now worried about defense. Coastal communities that had prospered from sea trade now feared every sail on the horizon. But here's the truly terrifying part. It was just the beginning. The Age of Terror. The Vikings who attacked Lindisfarne returned home rich. They had proven something crucial. Christian Europe was defenseless. The legendary Roman Empire that had once dominated the known world was gone. The Christian kingdoms that replaced it were fragmented, weak, constantly fighting each other, and they had no answer to seaborne assault. In 794 AD, just 1 year after Lindisfarne, Vikings struck the monastery at Jarrow, just 30 miles south. In 795, they hit Iona in Scotland, another major Christian centre. In 798, they attacked Ireland. The raids accelerated. 799, 802, 806, 807. By 820 AD, Viking raids were annual events. By 835, they were raiding with multiple fleets simultaneously. Here's the strategic genius of Viking warfare. They hit everywhere and nowhere. You couldn't predict where they'd strike next. You couldn't fortify every church, every monastery, every coastal town. They had strategic initiative. They chose when and where to attack. Defenders had to be strong everywhere all the time. Vikings only had to be strong in one place at one moment. The mathematics of terror worked in their favor. A successful raid required perhaps 50 to 100 warriors on 3 to 5 ships. The entire coast of Britain has roughly 7,000 miles of shoreline. Ireland has another 3,000. Francia, modern France, has thousands more. How do you defend 10,000 miles of coastline against enemies who can strike anywhere without warning? You can't. By 850 AD, the Vikings stopped going home for winter. They established permanent camps, long forts, in Ireland and England, fortified bases from which they could launch raids year-round. These weren't temporary incursions anymore. These were invasions. By 865 AD, the great heathen army arrived in England, thousands of warriors intent not on raiding but on conquest. Within 5 years, they had destroyed 3 of the 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria, the kingdom that included Lindisfarne, fell in 867. East Anglia fell in 869, its king Edmund captured and executed. Mercia fell in 874. Only Wessex survived barely under King Alfred the Great. By 878, Alfred controlled only a small swamp fortress. The Vikings controlled more than half of England. The Danelaw, the area under Viking control, would persist for generations. This transformation, from a single raid to the conquest of entire kingdoms, happened in just 85 years, one lifetime. A person born the year of the Lindisfarne raid could have lived to see Viking kingdoms established across northern England, Viking rulers in Dublin and York, Viking settlements in Iceland and Normandy. The psychological transformation was even more profound. By 900 AD, Vikings were no longer barbarian raiders. They were becoming Christian. They were marrying into local populations. They were building churches. Within 200 years of Lindisfarne, descendants of Vikings would rule England as legitimate Christian kings. But that assimilation required first the terror, then the recognition that Vikings couldn't be driven out, then the accommodation, then the integration. It was a process written in blood, launched by one brutal morning in June 793. Why Lindisfarne mattered. Hundreds of monasteries were raided during the Viking Age. Thousands of people were killed, enslaved, or driven from their homes. Why does Lindisfarne matter more than the others? Because it was first, because it was documented, because it was Lindisfarne. The raid on Lindisfarne became legendary not because it was the bloodiest or largest raid, it wasn't, but because it symbolized a fundamental shift in European power dynamics. It announced that a new force had arrived, one that didn't follow the old rules, one that the old powers couldn't stop. Think about the long-term consequences. The Viking Age forced European kingdoms to innovate. They couldn't defeat Vikings using traditional warfare, so they adapted. Alfred the Great of Wessex created a network of fortified towns, burhs, that could resist raids. He built ships to contest Viking naval superiority. He reorganized the army to maintain standing forces year-round. These innovations didn't just defeat the Vikings, they created the foundations of medieval kingdoms that would eventually dominate the world. The administrative structures, the tax systems, the concept of permanent military forces, the fortified towns that became cities, all were developed partly in response to the Viking threat that began at Lindisfarne. The psychological impact persisted for centuries. Even after Viking raids ceased, the memory remained. Medieval maps showed Scandinavia as the origin of ancient migrations that had destroyed the Roman Empire. Chronicles portrayed Vikings as divine punishment for sin. The word Viking became synonymous with violence, with chaos, with the collapse of civilization. But here's the irony historians love. The Vikings who terrorized Christian Europe eventually became Christian themselves. Viking settlers in Normandy became French. Viking rulers in England became English. Viking traders in Russia founded kingdoms that became the Russian state. The raiders became merchants, rulers, settlers. Their descendants include some of Europe's most distinguished noble houses. The cultural exchange went both ways. Vikings brought Scandinavian artistic styles, shipbuilding techniques, and legal traditions. Christian Europe brought literacy, administrative sophistication, and new agricultural methods. The hybrid culture that emerged was richer than either original. But none of that diminishes what happened on June 8, 793. On that morning, Vikings destroyed one of the holiest sites in Christian Europe. They killed dozens of monks. They desecrated sacred relics. They demonstrated that Christian civilization was vulnerable to a pagan force it didn't understand and couldn't stop. The Holiest of Lindisfarne. What can we learn from a raid that happened over 1,200 years ago? First, assumptions of invulnerability are dangerous. The monks of Lindisfarne believed their sacred status protected them. It didn't. Throughout history, societies that believed they were safe, whether due to geographic isolation, technological superiority, or divine favor, have been shocked by enemies who didn't share those assumptions. Second, technology matters. The Viking longship gave Norse warriors capabilities no other force in Europe possessed. Strategic mobility, tactical surprise, the ability to strike anywhere without warning. These advantages let a relatively small number of Vikings terrorize a much larger, wealthier civilization. Superior technology, in the hands of motivated warriors, has consistently defeated larger forces throughout history. Third, the initiative belongs to the attacker. Defenders must be strong everywhere, all the time. Attackers only need to be strong in one place at one moment. This asymmetry gives enormous advantage to mobile, aggressive forces against dispersed, defensive ones. The solution, concentration of force, fortification, rapid response, requires organizational capabilities that medieval Europe initially lacked. Fourth, cultural assumptions blind us to threats. The monks couldn't imagine a seaborne assault because their worldview didn't include that possibility. They were psychologically unprepared for an enemy who didn't respect their sacred status, who didn't fear their god, who wanted only their wealth. This failure of imagination, this inability to see the world through enemy eyes, has been repeated throughout history. Fifth, terror is a strategic weapon. The Vikings understood that the psychological impact of Lindisfarne was worth more than the plunder. The raid announced that nowhere was safe, that Christian sanctuaries were vulnerable, that God might not protect his faithful. That message, that terror, prepared the ground for future raids. Victims who were psychologically defeated offered less resistance. Communities that expected attack often paid tribute to avoid it. Fear was as valuable as gold. Sixth, history is made by those who act. The Vikings who rowed across the North Sea to attack Lindisfarne couldn't have known they were launching an age. They thought they were raiding a monastery. But their action, their willingness to take risks, to challenge the established order, to do what others thought impossible, changed history. Whether we approve or not, whether we call them heroes or villains, the Vikings shaped the Europe that shaped the world. The final accounting. Let's return to where we began, June 8, 793 AD, a small island off the coast of Northumbria, fewer than 100 Viking warriors, fewer than 100 monks, 4 hours of violence, dozens of dead, treasures stolen, sacred relics desecrated. By any objective measure, it was a minor event. More people died in countless forgotten skirmishes across medieval Europe. Larger treasures were stolen in the sack of Rome. Greater atrocities were committed during religious wars. But Lindisfarne mattered because of what it represented, the end of one age and the beginning of another. For 350 years, Christian monasteries had been sanctuaries. For 300 years after Lindisfarne, they would be targets. For 350 years, Europe had been relatively stable. For 300 years after Lindisfarne, it would be convulsed by invasions, migrations, and transformations. The Christian community at Lindisfarne survived, traumatized, diminished, but alive. They eventually recovered enough to create the magnificent Doomsday Stone, depicting the warriors who attacked them on one side and the Day of Judgment on the other. The message was clear: the Vikings might triumph in this world, but God's justice awaited in the next. In 875 AD, faced with renewed Viking attacks, the monks of Lindisfarne abandoned the island. They took with them the body of St. Cuthbert, the saint whose shrine had been desecrated in 793, and wandered for years before settling at Chester Street, then finally at Durham. Durham Cathedral, built to house St. Cuthbert's remains, became one of the most magnificent churches in England. The Vikings who attacked Lindisfarne are nameless. We don't know who led them, where exactly they came from, what happened to them after. They vanished into history, their names unrecorded, their individual fates unknown, but their action echoes across 1,200 years. Every time we hear the word Viking, we're hearing an echo of Lindisfarne. Every story of Norse raiders, every image of dragon-proud ships, every tale of brutal warriors from the north, it all begins on that June morning when the world changed. Here's the ultimate lesson of Lindisfarne: history belongs to those who have the courage or the audacity to challenge the established order. Whether that's courage or madness depends on your perspective. Whether we call them heroes or villains depends on whose side we're on. But what's undeniable is this: on June 8, 793 AD, fewer than 100 Viking warriors attacked a monastery on a small island off the coast of England. They killed dozens of monks, stole treasures accumulated over 150 years, and sailed away unpunished. And in doing so, they launched 3 centuries of transformation that reshaped Europe, influenced the development of medieval kingdoms, and created legends that persist to this day. The dragons that the Anglo-Saxons saw flying through the air before the raid weren't portents. They were prophecy, because the real dragons were coming across the sea, and once they landed, nothing would ever be the same. Think about that the next time someone tells you that individuals can't change history. Think about that when someone says that small events don't matter. Think about that when you face your own impossible odds. Sometimes all it takes to change the world is one ship, one morning, and the willingness to do what others think is impossible. The age of the Vikings began with the screams of dying monks and the crash of waves on a beach. It ended with Viking descendants ruling kingdoms, founding cities, and shaping the future of Europe. That's the mathematics of destruction. That's the algebra of terror. That's the calculus of courage or audacity or brutality, depending on your point of view. That's Lindisfarne.